Imagine going to the hospital because of a bothersome symptom or an unidentified illness, only to be confronted by police firearms. The situation seemed to have been lifted straight out of a nightmare, but Frank experienced just this. After a few tens of minutes of being confined to a doctor's office, he finally fought his way out, only to be met with the horrifying sight of cops ringing through the clean hospital halls with their guns drawn with orders. How did a simple hospital visit escalate into such a spectacular altercation? What circumstances could possibly lead to such an extreme response? The story behind Frank's ordeal is as unexpected as it is intriguing. Frank was no ordinary man. He had cultivated a lifelong passion for hiking, often declaring to his friends with a wide grin, "I'll hike until I'm 100 years old." Among his peers, he was known as a fearless adventurer, the kind of person who sought out challenges others would balk at. There was no trail too daunting, no summit too high for Frank. Over the years, his adventures had taken him to some of the most ionic and perilous trails in the world, from the mystical Inca Trail at Machu Picchu to the demanding Tour de Mont Blanc, the towering peaks of Mount Kilimanjaro, and the breathtaking depths of the Grand Canyon. Frank had conquered them all. Even the infamous Han Trail in China, a path so treacherous it's often called the most dangerous hike in the world, had not deterred him. His Hombu testament to his love for the wild. Among the framed photographs of his expeditions was a cherished image of Grandma Gatewood, a legendary figure in the hiking community and one of Frank's greatest inspirations. Thanks to his excellent physical fitness and ironclad stamina, Frank could easily outlast his companions on any trek. However, his unrelenting wanderlust came at a cost. Relationships were fleeting, often crumbling under the weight of his spontaneous disappearances. For the sake of adventure, he would leave with little warning, consumed by his drive to explore, leaving behind bewildered partners who could not keep up with his unpredictable lifestyle. By the time Frank reached 40, the fire of his youth had dimmed, though not extinguished. He still loved hiking, but began to recognize the need for a more stable life. Slowly, he shifted his focus, dreaming of starting a family and settling down. It was a gradual transformation, a testament to how time and maturity can alter even the most adventurous of spirits. Frank knew he needed to find the right woman, someone who would not only appreciate him for who he was, but also complement his reserved yet thoughtful personality. This realization was both exciting and daunting. Over the years, his attempts at dating had dwindled, and his confidence in navigating romantic relationships had worn thin. The last time he ventured into the dating world, it ended poorly. The woman he took out barely spoke, her responses clipped and indifferent. Frank couldn't tell if it was nerves or disinterest, but her silence was telling enough. She never reached out afterward, leaving him to stew in quiet self-doubt for months. Then came Stephanie, a spark in his otherwise monotonous days. She was vibrant and quick-witted, and their conversations flowed seamlessly over text. Frank felt a giddy thrill whenever his phone buzzed with her messages. Their exchanges, which often stretched from dusk till dawn, became the highlight of his routine. He worked from home, giving him plenty of time to savor these moments and dissect her every word, searching for signs of shared feelings. Frank was smitten, and for the first time in a long while, he felt a glimmer of hope for something meaningful. When their first date approached, Frank's excitement was laced with of apprehension. What if the dynamic they shared through screens didn't translate in person? Still, he resolved to approach the evening with an open mind, ready for whatever came of it. The restaurant buzzed with life when he arrived, but Frank found himself distracted, scanning the room for her. When Stephanie finally appeared, his heart skipped a beat. She was even more stunning than her photos suggested. Yet as the evening wore on, Frank began to sense a subtle shift in her demeanor. The playful energy she exuded in their texts seemed muted. Her smiles were polite but restrained, her laughter never quite reaching her eyes. It didn't take long for Frank to piece things together. Stephanie's gaze flickered over him, occasionally assessing Frank was self-aware enough to recognize the silent judgment. He looked older in person than in his carefully chosen profile pictures, and Stephanie, with her youthful glow, seemed quietly disappointed. Her disinterest stung, but Frank couldn't falter. He understood the allure of youth. He'd once been young, himself drawn to its vivacity and promise. By the end of the date, he chose to bow out gracefully, offering her a kind but final goodnight at home. Frank lay in bed reflecting, disappointed but not bitter, he told himself. It was simply another lesson learned. The next morning, as sunlight filtered through his blinds, Frank stirred awake. A strange, persistent itch nagged at his right thumb. Still groggy, he stumbled to the bathroom to inspect it. The skin looked unremarkable at first glance, but upon closer inspection, he noticed tiny, almost imperceptible holes dotting the surface. Startled but not overly alarmed, he washed his hands vigorously, thinking perhaps it was a minor irritation. Yet the itch remained. He shrugged it off, chalking it up to dry skin or some innocuous cause, and moved on with his routine. After a quick morning workout followed by a rejuvenating shower, Frank decided to treat himself to breakfast at his favorite cafe. Sitting by the window, sipping on a cup of freshly brewed coffee, he glanced at his thumb again to his dismay. The holes were still there, faint but undeniably real. He rubbed his fingers over them, half expecting the texture of his skin to feel different, but it didn't. A sense of unease began to creep in, though he couldn't quite put his finger on why. For now, he dismissed it as nothing more than a peculiar annoyance, choosing to focus instead on the steaming plate of eggs and toast that had just arrived at his table. But in the back of his mind, a tiny voice whispered that something was amiss. To Frank's dismay, the holes in his thumb had grown larger, their edges rough and dark. Panic surged as he quickly shoved his hand into his pocket, hoping no one would notice. Once back at his apartment, he hurried to the bathroom, determined to stop whatever was happening. Turning the tap on full blast, he scrubbed his thumb furiously, but the holes only widened, deepening as though something unseen was eating away at his skin. Terrified, Frank grabbed his phone and called the nearest hospital, his voice unsteady as he described his symptoms. He couldn't fathom how it had started, maybe something from his date, a shopping trip, or an outing with friends, but he knew he needed help immediately. The nurse on the line scheduled him for a same-day appointment, her calm demeanor doing little to ease his nerves. At the hospital, Frank was greeted by a long line of patients. The sharp, sterile smell of antiseptic filled the air, triggering his deep dislike for hospitals. He sat in the waiting room cradling his hand, trying to ignore the slow, relentless itch and the gnawing fear of what might come next. Frank's dislike of hospitals stemmed partly from his staunch belief in prevention. His strict exercise regimen wasn't just about staying fit. It was his way of avoiding medical consultations altogether, a strategy that had served him well until now. But as he sat in the waiting room cradling his hand, he couldn't help but feel that his defenses had failed him. His mind raced as he replayed the last few days, searching for any moment that could explain what was happening. He wasn't focused on pinpointing the exact cause. He knew that was a job for the doctor, but rather on recalling anything that might help the medical staff piece together the puzzle. Was it something he touched? Something he ate? The questions looped endlessly in his mind, the unknown gnawing at him as much as the itch in his thumb. The itch had returned more persistent. Now, as if mocking his helplessness, Frank shifted uncomfortably, glancing around the room to distract himself. That's when he noticed the whispers. The quiet murmurs seemed to ripple through the waiting area, subtle at first, but growing louder. Lifting his gaze, he realized the source. Everyone was staring at him, or more specifically at his thumb. His heart sank as he glanced down. The holes had grown so prominent that they were now clearly visible, even from across the room. A grotesque spectacle that demanded attention. Frank's chest tightened with embarrassment and unease. Lowering his head, he clenched his hand into a fist and stuffed it into his pocket, wishing he could disappear entirely. Frank was unable to escape the murmurs, though nobody openly addressed them to him. He noticed a patient conferring quietly, with the nurses glancing occasionally toward him. It was clear to Frank that his hand's condition frightened the other patients. He understood their fear and didn't resent them for it. He acknowledged that he would feel the same if he were in their shoes. After all, it's a human instinct, he reasoned silently. Shortly thereafter, Frank was summoned to the doctor's office, bypassing several others who were ahead of him. He surmised that the urgency was due to the alarming appearance of his thumb. Frank felt relieved to be seen sooner than anticipated, sparing him from more time breathing the medicated air he loathed. The doctor conducted several tests and revealed that the infection in his thumb had been present longer than Frank had initially believed. Reflecting back, Frank linked the onset to his last hiking trip, though the exact cause of the infection eluded him. Following further inquiries, Frank asked to use the restroom while the doctor awaited additional test results. The findings that came back were profoundly unsettling. The doctor, unfamiliar with such an infection, consulted with peers. One experienced colleague declared at an urgent situation. The doctor hastily left the office. Moments later, Frank returned, only to find the room empty. After waiting briefly, he tried to leave, but discovered the door was locked from the outside. He knocked and called out for help, hearing activity outside, yet receiving no response. "Hey, I think I'm locked in. Can someone open the door?" "Hello, hello," he called out repeatedly. Frank realized that help wasn't on the way and intensified his pounding on the office door. By then, the doctor had already alerted the police. Frank, putting his full body weight into it, continued to slam against the door. The nurses urged him to calm down, assuring him that everything was being managed. However, Frank, consumed by fury, eventually shattered the door. Just a few moments later, still brimming with anger, he found himself facing armed police officers with their weapons drawn. Frank immediately calmed down and prostrated himself on the ground, placing his hands on his head. As directed by the police, the doctor approached him to clarify the situation. Frank had contracted a highly contagious disease and needed to be isolated. The other patients from the waiting room would be tested too. The doctor informed him that he might have come into contact with a contagious plant. During his hiking trip, Frank was asked to list all recent locations he had visited and people he had interacted with to help trace and control the spread of the infection. The infectious plant was eventually identified and eradicated. After watching the story above, do you have any thoughts?